So hi, welcome to the 2021 beekeeping season. We're getting started with one of our first videos of the year here. Topic of today is going to be choosing an apiary location and setting up hives, how we set it up, what we look for and where we place our hives, and then how we actually do our hive stands. That'll come into play with these cinder blocks here in just a little bit, so stay tuned for that. We'll show you how we use those. So yeah, we counting our chickens before they hatch. In some sense, the bees seem to have survived the winter pretty well this year, sitting at around 30% winter losses this year. So it seems like we're going to have space for expansion, so we're looking around for new spots to put bees, new apiary locations, so we can offer different zip codes in our honey products this year, and also just have more space to expand. So we're going to go over a little bit what we look for and what we think is important.
The most important thing when choosing a new apiary location is access. Like, how are you going to get to the beehives? Like, if it's way back in the woods and you have to walk back through a trail to get there and whatnot, that's very much so a suboptimal location. Like, the best location you could possibly get is to be able to drive right up to with your truck and unload supers and whatnot, because
we're lazy.
well, and also because you don't want to be toting full boxes of bees up a trail, across a hill and whatnot, up a flight of steps or up a ladder. Like,
yeah.
The closer you can get to it with something the closer you can get to your hives with your vehicle is better.
That's one of the main things we're going to look for, is how close can we get, and what's it look like to get there. I mean, if it's going to be a uphill walk both ways to check your bees, that's going to be a real hassle, especially when it comes time for honey harvest. So we'd say thing number one is make sure you can get to it easily, and consider all the equipment and the heavy equipment you're going to have to be trucking back and forth. Pick a good spot that's easily accessible. That's thing number one. So the second most important thing that we look for is water access. How close is water? Where are the bees going to be getting their water from? You have to be very, very conscious of that, especially if you're putting it in more of a developed where people live in an area like that. Bees are going to go to pretty well the closest water, and if that's somebody's pool, you could have problems on your hands. So be mindful of where you put it. Think about where they're going to get the water from.
And if the closest source is your neighbor's pool, you should seriously consider giving them a source much closer to like in the bee yard, basically a trough, a fish pond or something,
a tap that trickles onto a plate or something. You got to be mindful of it. You also don't want it where your water source is like directly across a road from your hives either, because you're going to lose a lot to the road then, or you'll tend to lose a lot more, I should say. So watch out for your water access. Make sure that it's close enough for them, it's not 2 miles away, and it's also somewhere where it's not going to bother anybody if there's a sheet of bees there on a 100-degree day. So watch out for that.
I think I heard a bee just fly past.
I heard a couple too.
So for us, the third most important thing is how level the ground is at the prospective apiary location. Because we do foundationless beekeeping, or we do treatment-free beekeeping, which one of the components of that is foundationless, it helps with mite control. You have to have your foundations dead level from side to side, or else your combs will be drawn wonky, because the bees draw with gravity, and if your frames are off-center, then the bees are just going to stick frames in strange ways.
And it's a real mess to try to do anything.
So for us, we have to have the ground be level. And it's also helpful when carrying stuff around, because you don't really want to have to walk up and down a hill carrying boxes, which harkens back to the first point.
We'll touch more on leveling hive bases and all that in the later part of this video when we show you how we actually set up our hive bases. So we've covered 3 things already. Those 3 things we would consider to be your most important. Those are the ones you really have to be concerned about. Keep them level, make them accessible, make sure their water access is good. There's also a bunch of smaller things to consider when you're setting up a location that aren't quite as important as that, but maybe if all those are right and these are all wrong, maybe you should reconsider it. So some of the smaller things we look for are, do they have access to sun? You don't want to put these bees in the shade where they're in the shade 24/7 and they never get any sunlight. It makes them a little less productive. They wake up slower in the morning. Hive doesn't warm up as quick. And then also hive beetles really like the shade and the cool. So if you keep them in the shade, you're going to have more hive beetle problems than if you don't. Now up north where we are here, we don't have just the worst problems with hive beetles, and our strain of bees seems to handle hive beetle problems pretty well already, but it's still something to consider. Get them some sunlight so they wake up pretty quick in the morning.
For example, we don't have any issues with it back at our 19540 apiary, because that apiary is in full sun. Whereas the smaller 17522 apiary gets shaded for a significant portion of the day, and that's the only one we ever see hive beetles in. Like, they never progresses to be a problem because the bees corral it, but that's something we've noticed. At full sun, you never see hive beetles. In the shade, or even in part shade, you start seeing adult hive beetles.
Along with that is, as far as where you're putting it and what shade and foliage is around, comes in your forage. It's not something you have to be concerned about so much depending on your area. You don't want to be putting bees down in the middle of a pine forest where there's nothing around. But if there's field edges and little stands of trees and corners of fields around, so they actually have something to eat.
Or even in town, there'll be plenty of like flower beds and window boxes and whatnot. They'll find plenty of forage. It's just you don't want to be putting them in the middle of a nectar desert, like in like I said, a pine forest or in the desert.
There's wheat fields for 3 miles that way and that way. It's
something to consider.
Like we said, it's a small thing, but be a little mindful of it.
Another thing to consider. We're just going to roll right into it.
Yeah, I was going to cut it. Apparently, you're ready to keep bees or something. So let's
ready to get going here. Another thing to consider is the security of your beehives. Like, it's both from people and from the elements. Like, as far as you don't want to be putting them somewhere where people can clearly see them and harass them, by harassing or theft, because there are some unscrupulous beekeepers out there who will swipe your beehives. One thing you can do if you have to put them somewhere in where people can see them is paint your hives camouflage, and it'll hide them better. But that's something to think about. But as far as the elements go, both from animals, like if you're in bear country, you want to consider putting up an electric fence. Or the big thing for us is you never want to put your hives on a floodplain, like right next to a creek. Because if you get a 100-year flood or 100-year or even a decade rainstorm, your hives could be downstream before you even think about, oh no, this rain could be problematic for me.
We keep treatment-free bees, but I don't think we can make them survive a flood.
Well,
they don't adapt to that so quickly.
Depending on how high the flood is, they'll just move up into the top box and be fine. But if it's a big enough flood, then just washes the beehives away. It's something to consider. You don't want to put your beehives in a floodplain.
So the last small thing that we want to encourage you to consider when you're picking out a location is, are you able to put as many hives there as you want to?
Might want to.
Or might want to. Think about your future growth and expansion. Is there space here to grow? Is the landowner okay with 5 hives, or are they okay with 50? Or where's that level? Make sure that everyone's on the same page and that space is going to be worth your time to invest time into to get it ready and put bees there. So just make sure that you plan for growth if that's what you're looking for, and that the space you're choosing can accommodate it. So now that we've went over what we consider to be the things you should look for in an apiary, let's show you one that we've picked out, and we'll cover the pros and cons and what we found at this spot, so you can see in practice what that actually looks like. To begin with, here you can see behind us is where we're going to be setting up the hives. We'll cover the big 3 that we talked about: accessibility, water access, and being level. So to begin with, as far as accessibility goes, the driveway is right there.
Field lane.
Field lane. So we can drive right up here, no problem. We don't even have to drive past the farmer's house, so going to be no problems with disturbing them if we're here at odd hours. And the lane's right there. Accessibility, check. They can't ask for better than this. Second thing, Sean, you can take it, would be the water access.
Water access. There is a creek right back there in those woods. So
what is it? 200, 300 yards away?
300 yards, perfect. Like, ideal. It's going to be a steady, solid source of water for them all year long, when it's not going to be bothering anybody.
And the third big thing, and one of the small things, level and area. I mean, what better can you ask for on this? I mean, it's not perfect, but it's certainly not going to be a lot of work. And as far as space goes,
the farmer explicitly said we can take up as much space here as we want, because they do not use this section of the property. So we can easily throw 50, 60 hives back here if we want to, as our operation expands.
There's just a little space.
As far as the sun goes in this location, south is that way. So it's not a perfect location because of all of the trees here, but we're going to talk with the farmer about possibly cleaning some of this brush out so the bees get morning sun. But then there is nothing above them, so the sun's going to be beating down on them during the heat of the day, which, depending on where you are in life and how healthy you are, being out in the sun in July could be a problem. So you might want a little bit of shade, but for us, it's not a big deal. Like, we strong. Put on a white jacket.
B-man strong.
Put on a white jacket, you'll be fine. As far as security goes, this is in the back corner of the farmer's property.
You can't see the road here hardly, so
almost nobody's gonna know these things are back here,
except you. Don't rat us out.
And then as far as flooding goes, this is on top of the hill. The creek is...
If it floods this high, I think we got other problems. That creek got a long way to go.
And then forage, this is in the middle of farm country. There's field edges and pastures literally everywhere. And this is actually an organic farm. So that's one thing we didn't mention before. Spraying. If you do put your beehives on a farm, you want to talk with the farmer about what he sprays, where he sprays, when he sprays, and consider where to put your hives in relation to that. Here, organic farm, we're good to go.
And he actually has a stand of black locust trees up along the top of the next hill over, which will be excellent forage and should make for some really excellent honey, provided we can get some good bees here to make honey for us. So yeah, let's go into a little bit how exactly we set up the hive bases now, what we do. It's not that complicated, but we'll show it to you here pretty quick. Our idea is to use cinder blocks like this. It's an 8x8 by 16 cinder block, hollow as you can see. And we buy seconds varieties from the concrete company that's close to us. So these things cost us 86 cents a piece, something like that. And we need 3 of them. So they're very cheap. They're exceptionally durable. I mean, we're gonna be setting up 18 hive stands here today. And in total, it cost us $69, which is pretty nice. That includes bricks for the top even. So they're very cheap, and these will outlast me. So they're pretty useful for that.
Another plus with cinder blocks is that they're very low, which means that if you have a hive that puts 5 or 6 supers on, you don't have to reach up quite as far as if you had a custom-built hive stand that was 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. It makes bigger hives much easier to work with. It does have a drawback in that you have to be a little bit more careful with how high the weeds and whatnot grow around your beehives, but bring a weed whacker back and wear your bee jacket, you'll be fine.
One of the ways with lumber prices these days, these cinder blocks, I mean, lumber prices, back when I priced these hive stands out last time, was ridiculous, and lumber's doubled or tripled since then. So these things are pretty much the most cost-effective option. And then regular wooden hive stands, you're talking starting out this high, and we have a deep and a half below that yet. So it really helps for the big hives because we only grow big hives. We're always reaching up pretty high. So
you might have noticed from earlier in the video and the way we have these set up is that we do not put our beehives in lines. When you put beehives in lines, you wind up with drifting issues. The bees on the outside gradually start to move towards the middle. You can clearly see that, at least from what I understand, is that if you have a long line of beehives, the ones in the middle get stronger than the ones on the end, because the workers drifting back and going to the wrong colony, and it's easier for them to find the ones in the middle for whatever reason. So we put our beehives up in these C shapes. So it's six bees or 6 hives in a C, and then we'll set C's up in different orientations so that there's no lines and everything looks unique. It's particularly important, at least in our opinion, for queen mating, because you're almost definitely going to wind up having superseders or whatnot at some point in time. And if you're doing splits and raising your own queens, you need to have orientations that allow the queens to return to the correct beehives. Because if you have a line and she goes in the wrong one, she's dead. The colony she came from is hopelessly queenless. They go queenless, and you're down a beehive, or you have to do some quick emergency work to try to save it. Whereas with this C shape, it's much easier for the virgin queens to find their way home. At least in our we've only had 3 or 4 failures. It works great.
Yeah, so we just try to avoid lines, and we do these little C shapes with entrances all pointing different directions to try to help with drifting issues. And then it also helps somewhat to direct the bees to fly that way instead of flying this way right over the farm path. Doesn't do so well, but it's at least a little bit of something rather than just having all entrances facing this way. Of course they're going to go that way.
And we can at least sell it to the farmer that we're trying.
We're aiming them this way. See, bees only fly the way we point them.
So at this point, we have the bricks just thrown down roughly where we want them. We'll do that with the rest of the setups. Just throw everything down, make sure we have our spacing accurate and pointed the way we want it. And then we'll go through the leveling process and show you how we do that. Step 1, clear the grass. Get it close to level. check our work. Ooh. Front needs to come down a little bit. And make final adjustments.
So that's how we pick an apiary location and set up new hive stands. Together it took us 80 minutes to get these three C's set up. It's 18 hives. So you're looking about 8 to 10 minutes a hive base between this. So it's not the fastest, but these shouldn't ever need to be adjusted again. So as long as we're keeping bees, we'll be able to use them.
They should never rot. Termites never get into them. Should never settle. Be careful when you're doing it.
So it's kind of one of those things. It's a lot of work up front, and then you can forget about it, which is nice. So yeah, thanks for watching. If you have any ideas or comments or questions, drop them down below and we'll be happy to answer. Thanks for joining us.